This is Dennis Rundy. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg, author of American Veda. Our podcast, Spirit Matters, found at spiritmatterstalk.com. Our guest today, Emmanuelle Vaugh. He is an award-winning filmmaker whose work has been featured on National Geographic, PBS, the New York Times, the New Yorker, Al Jazeera, exhibited at the Smithsonian, and screened at festivals worldwide. He is also the director of the Spiritual Ecology Fellowship. Emmanuelle, thank you so very much for taking the time to come on our show today.
It's a pleasure to be with you both.
Emmanuelle, I want to talk to you about your global oneness project, the spiritual ecology work you do, and the filmmaking. But first, give us a little background about your own life and how you came to the work you do. And we know your father, Llewellyn, is a very well-known Sufi teacher. And so you are probably raised in that tradition. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. So I was born in London. My father is English, and we lived in a house with his teacher, a woman named Irina Tweedy, who in the late 50s traveled to India and met a Sufi master. And he asked her to bring this particular tradition of Sufism, which is the Naqshbandi Mujahideen tradition, because in Sufism there are different lineages, all with different practices. And she brought this tradition back to the West. And my father was one of her first students. And she was somewhat elderly, and my father bought a house at the time in North London and invited her to live downstairs. And my mom, who was also one of her students, my parents met as students of Mrs. Tweedy, was looking after her. So I grew up in kind of a modern day ashram in North London, where every day the house, and she lived downstairs in the basement apartment, or the first floor apartment, was open for meditation and satsang. And so we had anywhere between 50 and 100 people every day in our house meditating. They're meeting with a teacher, having this spiritual discussion, sharing dreams, which is part of the particular Sufi practices that we, from our tradition. So I grew up, in this very traditional spiritual environment, yet in the middle of an urban setting in North London.
Right.
So Sufism was kind of what I started breathing from the first moment I was born. It was around me all day and night.
Right. Emmanuelle, I wanted to ask, when you were a young kid and that was going on in your household, did you take to it right away, or was there some resistance toward it? Did it seem odd to you? Did it seem normal? And what type of spiritual practices did you engage in as a young kid?
So no, it definitely seemed normal. I think that when it's around you all the time when you're young, you think that's how everybody lives. I think it wasn't until I started going to school that I realized, oh, my friends' parents didn't meditate or pray like my parents did. I started practicing, I think, when I was 5 or 6 years old. So I would go downstairs and I would meditate for 2 or 3 hours with everybody who was down there. And I did that for a few years until I wanted to spend my after schools with my friends riding bikes and skateboarding in the neighborhood. And then again, I was, I guess, around 11 that I picked up the practice again. My father would make me sit and meditate with him twice a day. As I got older, of course, then I thought it was not normal. And like most kids did go through a bit of rebellious stage where I wanted to have a normal family. I wanted to have normal life. When I looked around for my peers, they didn't live the same life I did. So I guess between the ages of 11 and 14, I went through a bit of a rebellious phase where I was upset and angry that I had to be part of this world, which I felt was forcing me into places I didn't want to be. But at the age of 14, I shifted my perspective and became much more interested in living that life and deepening my own practice. And that's been the case since the age of 14.
And eventually, you obviously made your way to America. And I know your father lives in Northern California, so do you. I was surprised in looking at your bio to find that you had gone to the Berklee College of Music in Boston, which I used to live down the street from there. And that's a great school for jazz and music composition. And tell us about that and how that informed your spiritual life, if it did, and how you got into filmmaking.
My family was not a musical family. I grew up with my parents listening to a few records here and there, but honestly, they had to be quiet a lot of the time because people were downstairs meditating. So we didn't have a lot of music in the house. And my parents didn't consider themselves that musical. And I started getting interested in music when I was about 8 or 9. I started playing the cello. And then we moved to America when I was 11. My father was instructed to kind of take the tradition to America and open a spiritual center here. And he at that point was becoming the successor of Mrs. Tweedy and taking over responsibility of the tradition. And we moved to a small town in Northern California on the coast, so quite different environment to London. And at that time, I got into playing bass. I think when I was 6th grade, I showed up at a small school, and there was music class. They said, "Anybody, what instruments do you play?" I said, "I play the cello." They said, "Great, you can play the bass." And they put a bass in my hand. And I kind of took to it and really enjoyed the instrument, and within a year or two became really serious about music and specifically jazz. Somebody gave me a Miles Davis record, I think when I was 12 or 13, and I fell in love with it and completely immersed myself in that medium and just listened to jazz records night and day and practiced, transcribed, played. And I think when I was 15, I started playing professionally. It's kind of a funny thing that there's not enough bass players out there. And once you play the bass and some people know about it, then you get hired for gigs. So I was out playing in nightclubs and all sorts of venues when I was 15 with, much older, much more competent musicians. And I spent most of my time learning on the bandstand, learning songs, learning repertoire, learning how to improvise, when I shouldn't necessarily have been out there performing. But I loved it. I think I love the discipline of practicing. I love the possibility of being able to improvise within a framework that, there's so much you have to learn to be able to play jazz well in order to be able to freely express yourself and improvise. And I loved all the things you needed to have to learn in order to be able to do that. So I guess if you want to compare it to how it related to my own spiritual practice, I felt like the discipline you have to have in one's personal practice, whether it's meditation or other practices, in order to be able to experience a sense of freedom, to me made sense in relation to jazz and improvisation. Ended up dropping out of high school when I was 16 to pursue my studies in music and play, and ended up, going to Berklee College of Music and studying improvisation and composition, and played with many great jazz artists for a number of years, led my own groups, released records, and had what was a somewhat promising jazz career in that small idiom that is jazz in America today.
Right.
And then in my mid-20s, I felt the call to be more closely connected to the work that my father was doing outwardly. He was writing a lot about what was happening in the world, what role spiritual values and spiritual consciousness can play in how we both understand the problems that we're facing and find ways to move forward. And ended up transitioning into filmmaking over a few years. An opportunity came up to work on a film. I took it. I loved the medium. To me, there were similarities between documentary filmmaking and working in jazz. You've got to improvise. You're always covering new things, working with new people, and the same idea of kind of learning on the bandstand that applied for me here.
Emmanuelle, do you do the music for your documentaries? And where do you still put a significant amount of time into practicing your instrument, or you're totally absorbed in the filmmaking now?
I don't play professionally anymore and haven't for, I'm almost about eight years now. And I don't practice too much. Occasionally I'll pick up the instrument, but I don't have as much time as I used to. I do compose some of the music for the films I make, not all of them. I collaborate with, actually was a very good friend of mine at Berkeley, who's now an acclaimed film composer in Hollywood. And so we collaborate on some of the projects together.
And to segue into your the filmmaking and the spiritual content in it, I was looking at some of the titles of your films, and it looks like there's a kind of mission to your filmmaking, and a kind of common theme that may run through it. Could you discuss what your purpose as a filmmaker is and how it fits into your spiritual life?
Sure. To me, the essence of my spiritual practice can't be different from how I live my life and what I do with it. I don't want to have a practice where I only sit on a cushion meditating, after business hours, so to speak. To me, spiritual practice is something that is practiced every second of every day. And so from the beginning, when I played jazz, I still viewed it in that capacity. Maybe it wasn't as direct as it is now in my filmmaking, but I still connected to it in that way. And my filmmaking is very much about how can we use the power of story. How can we capture the voices of people who aren't heard in the mainstream media to express what is happening in our world and to examine what are the underlying crises that aren't often discussed. And I'm not talking purely about the spiritual, the ecological or social crises, but the spiritual crisis that is underlying those issues. And so I feel that my mission, if you want to call it a mission, is to try and capture the stories of people or places around the world and share what's happening in a way that can get people to think about what this underlying crisis is and what are these deeper issues that we need to look at, and how can we re-examine our lives both individually and collectively to best respond in a meaningful way to what is happening.
Ted, tell us about the Spiritual Ecology Fellowship that you direct. And is that directly related to your filmmaking?
That isn't directly related to my filmmaking, no. But there is crossover. I mean, a lot of the films that I've made explore themes related to spiritual ecology, and spiritual ecology, of course, is a very big, emerging field, if you will. With this kind of basic, fundamental principle at its essence, which is that everything in life is sacred and interconnected. And a lot of my films have been exploring that in different ways, whether it's talking about, how different cultures are living that and the challenge that they're facing as a result of the encroach of the modern world on their cultures and systems. But the fellowship is really a new project that emerged in the last few years as both my father's work and my work took a direction towards spiritual ecology and kind of trying to articulate what that field is. And the fellowship is a program where we offer up to 10 emerging young leaders a place in a program where they will have an opportunity for deep learning, exposure to mentors and teachers working in this field, and give them a chance to apply what they've learned into practice in creating projects which offer innovative ways to put spiritual ecology and its principles into action. And the fundamental principles of spiritual ecology that we're working with is reverence and interconnection, kind of the worldview that is everything is sacred and must be revered and everything is interconnected. And then to act with that understanding through compassion, service, and stewardship. So we're giving the people we're working with in the program an opportunity to explore that in both, a philosophical and spiritual capacity, and then also a practical capacity as they engage with these ideas in a variety of ways.
Emmanuelle, we're recording this interview on January 25th of 2017. We're 5 days into the Trump administration, and he has already taken certain steps that feel ominous to many of us who care about the environment. How you're involved in spiritual ecology? How have you reacted to this? How have the people around you reacted? What are your concerns, if any, and what would you propose we do about it? It's a small question.
Oh gosh, yeah. I think that like many people around this country and around the world, there's a tremendous amount of shock and despair and an overwhelming feeling of of uncertainty that's gripping everybody, and I definitely have felt that. Something I think about a lot is how are we going to respond to this crisis, because it really is an incredible crisis that we're now dealing with. I mean, many of the issues are not new, but what's being brought to the surface with this current administration and this agenda offers, gosh, a much more challenging view of how it's actually going to turn out. I mean, there's so much out there in the media about responding to this and offering all sorts of analysis of what's really happening. The shadow side of America had to be revealed at some time. You can't sweep everything under the rug forever. Obviously globalization and its impacts on people, et cetera. But, I try and take the long view. I've always wanted to try and take the long view. Before Trump was elected, this country, this world was dealing with tremendous, overwhelming challenges that looked unsurmountable to address, to be perfectly honest. And I think now it's just even more in our face that is the case, and whatever hope we thought we might have might be dashed. But I do have hope that we can create change on all the levels we need to, but I think it's going to take a lot longer and be a lot harder to implement that. And I think that it's going to require a lot of resilience on every level from people who want to have a world that their children can actually live and breathe in and create a life that is grounded in something other than a materialistic, greed-based society. Right. And I think it's just we're living in a time where the rules aren't so clear anymore. I think the in quote alternative fact reality is just almost a surface level materialization of that. But everything is on the table. Things are changing so fast, and I think that's what happens when the world starts to rip apart. And that's what's been happening for quite some time. We've been abusing and destroying our world for a long time, and now we're just starting to feel it in a much more divisive capacity or divisive way because of what's happening in Washington.
Right. I mean, I think that you take a few steps forward, and I think people maybe were assuming we'd continue just moving forward, but what seems to happen usually is there are steps backward, and you can't give up at that time. You have to keep moving forward. I have a question though. I love documentary films, and I look forward to seeing your films. I hope I can get them online or whatever. But I always think, how do people fund documentary films? They don't attract as big an audience usually, and the funding of them must be a challenge. How do you go about it?
I think that documentary has blown up in the last few years. There's a lot more films being made in that genre. The cost of making films has dropped dramatically as the equipment became cheaper, the editing software became cheaper, and all these different platforms to then share and release those stories have multiplied. So it's in some ways a kind of a golden age of documentary, where you don't need as much money as you used to be able to produce films. Right. Usually documentaries are not made by large crews of people. It's one or two people, maybe three or four, working long, hard hours. The director is also the producer, is also the cinematographer, is also the editor, is also, the person getting coffee. So it's a different kind of approach to filmmaking than narrative fiction or TV. And there's more and more interest, I think, in supporting those stories. So people, as those platforms have emerged where those kind of stories can find an outlet, people have shown that there's interest in watching those stories. It used to be that you had only a few outlets where stories could be shown, whether it was, a major network or maybe HBO, PBS, but now they're everywhere. And you can have your own platforms as well as work with the established ones. So you can connect your audiences and build communities around that, which is something we've done for more than 10 years, which has allowed us to kind of build an audience, build a relationship with communities all around the world, as well as, through traditional distributors and broadcasters. So it gives us a platform to share our stories, which makes it easier then to raise funds for creating those films.
Interesting, because it's kind of a democratization of filmmaking,
Right,
made possible by technology, similar to the way book publishing has been democratized, at some challenge to quality and reliability. So it's probably similar in the filmmaking world, where you don't have the curators that we used to have, but more and more people have access to making films. And it's a very similar thing with spirituality. To bring it back to spirituality, there's always been a democratization of spiritual practice, taking it out of the hands of large institutions and making teachings available to more and more people. Which brings me to a question. Some of this is generational. I see in your bio that you were born in 1979, which makes you a few years
38, yeah.
a few years shy of 40.
30 something, 36. Something.
But not yet 40. So how you're in touch with a generation. Dennis and I are of your father's generation. The spiritual crisis we've been talking about, and the ramifications of current political situation. How are people in your generation responding to it? I want hope. I want hope for the future. So tell me, how things are, how spiritually aware and environmentally aware are your cohort?
That's a great question. I think that I have a tremendous amount of hope in this new generation, because I feel that they do not separate out their own spiritual practice or their desire for spiritual practice from what they see around them and the challenges we're facing. So for them, environmental awareness and spiritual awareness are often very linked, and they see a spiritual practice in walking out onto the streets and marching and protest. They see a spiritual practice in deciding how they're going to live their lives and the choices they're going to make, whether that's what they eat or what they buy or what they decide to do with their careers as a spiritual practice. So I think there's much more integration in the new generation, in my generation and millennial generation, than in your generation, where I feel from my observations is there was an emerging spiritual school coming from the East to America in the 60s and 70s to the West, and it was not necessarily integrated in a societal way that I feel this new generation is trying to. So I feel very hopeful about that. I feel like they're not interested in just pursuing a path of self-growth, and that is something I'm so happy to see, because I think we don't have time for only self-growth now, where we can leave life behind and focus on our own personal spiritual development. It has to be done in the midst of responding to the world that we're living in. And we need actively engaged spiritual citizens at this time more than ever.
Right. What are you working on now? What film and what subject matter?
I'm just starting to work on a new feature, which is a little too early in its development to really talk about. And
the emphasis, the subject matter always touches at least upon spirituality. Is that right?
This film's actually directly about spiritual ecology, but it's just in its nascent days, so I'm a little reticent to talk about it too much. And then we're doing a film, a shorter film, maybe a 20, 30-minute film on this wonderful tradition in the northwest of the U.S., these intertribal canoe journeys that happen on an annual basis, where Native communities who always practiced and travel by canoe have revived this tradition of annually visiting a host community to practice the potlatch ceremony. They travel by canoe from all these places in the northwest to a central location. So it's it's a remarkable movement, because it isn't just about, those 5 days or 3 days of traveling from their community to host community. It's all the months of preparation of connecting with this tradition, reviving this ancient tradition, how it is providing opportunity and hope for the younger generation, often in environments where they're dealing with tremendous challenges.
Wow.
I look forward to seeing that. I mean, that's a tremendous subject matter, and I think this is the type of information that needs to be disseminated, that people need to understand, especially young people. I mean, a big part of the battle to keep the world's, to promote spiritual ecology is education, is exposure, is getting people the information that will inspire them to do the right things. And there's so much out there now. Sometimes it's hard to have the filters to find out what's real and what isn't. But anyway, we're excited about that. When it comes out, we should maybe do another show and specifically discuss the film.
Yeah. I remember reading about potlatches in anthropology classes, 40 years ago, and I always wanted to attend one. Emmanuelle, tell us about the Global Oneness Project.
Sure. So the Global Oneness Project, we started that back in 2005, 2006, I guess. So it's over 10 years old. And it's an online multimedia platform, a collection of stories and companion educational material and lesson plans for educational use primarily in North America. And it's based around the idea that the power of stories to connect people to important issues and to engage them into deep discussion and learning about the most critical issues of the day is something that is needed in educational settings. And what we found is that, over the years, is that a story can come alive in a classroom in the teacher's hands in a remarkable way. It's like it takes on a new life. You share a 10, 15-minute film, you read an article, you look at a multimedia piece or a photo essay, and if you're just watching it or viewing it on your computer at home, you may learn something and connect to it. But in a classroom, it takes on a whole new life. Mm-hmm. And so we really dedicated this whole organization and its focus to trying to support teachers and give them valuable materials and resources to engage students at the high school level in these kinds of issues and stories, so that they can connect on a global level and explore what being a global citizen really looks like. So we have a huge library of stories and companion education material that we distribute to tens of thousands of schools around the U.S. With the hope that story can be a powerful vehicle for change in the lives of young people.
Great. Go ahead, Phil.
Is there and is a common theme to the Global Oneness Project what it sounds like, that to sort of bring attention to the I always think there's a difference between just interconnectedness and oneness, and you chose the word oneness, which is very consistent with Sufi spirituality for a reason, I assume. Is that correct?
That is correct. And yes, the name does represent what our primary focus is. So in Sufism, one of the central tenets is the belief in the oneness of being. And then interconnectedness is an aspect of that. And so the stories, the companion lesson plans, they may talk about, social issues, environmental issues, political issues, economic issues, culture issues, but there's always an emphasis on trying to show this oneness that we all share, and how that needs to be a consciousness that we actively engage in and use as a reference point as we understand how to live in this world at this time.
Right. I have one last question for you, Emmanuelle, and that is, are you optimistic or pessimistic for the future? I'm hoping for a certain answer, but go ahead.
I think I'm a pessimistic optimist.
Very good. Yeah. Explain that.
I mean, I'm a realist, and I've seen a lot, and I've been to a lot of places, and I've talked to a lot of people who are on the front lines of climate change, or are at, what I call the edges of the world, off the beaten tracks, far away from our urban centers, who are often dealing with the issues that we hear about, in a direct way every day of their lives, as their houses sink because of rising seas, or their food sources disappear, or their rivers are polluted, or their children and families are dying because of that pollution. But what I found is, in my experience of being in those communities, there I've seen the most vital and powerful hope come to life. As people say, I'm not going to accept this reality, and I am going to fight for a future that is grounded in what I believe to be true and to be right. And that has always inspired me to get past those moments where pessimism and futility can take over. And I am optimistic about the future. I am optimistic about the younger generation. I am optimistic that we can find a way through the current crises and this tremendous challenge we're going to be dealing with over the next 4 years, the next 40 years. But I am here. I'm in this life and this body, and I think I should be doing whatever I can to support, the changes that we need to have come to life in our world.
Right.
Well, you've made me more optimistic, and I thank you for that, and I appreciate all your efforts, and I hope that you're right about your generation, because it's the torch has been passed, and so I hope wish you great success in all that you're doing, and want to thank you for being with us, giving us this time today.
Well, thank you both. It's been a pleasure talking with both of you.
Great. Thank you.
All right.